Okay, sorry, I had an unexpected visitor there. So, back to your mentally challenged cousin. Imagine after the baseball game, you go and you meet all the players. You meet all the coaches. You meet you meet all the players, sign autographs and everything. Then after the tour of the dugout, your cousin says, "Yeah, I met all the players and I met all the coaches and everything, but where were the Cardinals? I really wanted to meet," and you say, "What, like a bird?" And you say, no. I didn't expect them to be birds. But where was the team, the Cardinals, right? Now, the team, the Cardinals, cannot be anything except for the people that make it up. And expecting it to be something, expecting it to be more than the people that make it up is to commit this category mistake that Ryle is talking about, right? So how the $1,000,000 question then is how is the mind-body problem how is dualism committing a category mistake? Well, Ryle thinks that Descartes has poisoned our thinking about the relationship between the mind and the body. That the mind and the body are not opposite things. They're not in any sort of competition with each other. Ryle thinks that the mind and the brain are just two ways of describing the same thing. That your physical brain is doing this thing, and the thing that it does is it creates your mind, it creates mental states, it creates belief desire states, it creates you, yourself, right? Your view of the world. And your physical body, including your physical brain, are not in any sort of competition with that. They're not the opposite of that. Your mind is just one way your physical brain is, right? One way to think about this is, in class I will often ask if there's a student who has a nickname they don't mind sharing, right? So let's say there is a student named John who is known to his friends as Shorty, right? And let's say that there are people who know John as John, and there are some groups of friends who don't even know his name is John. They just know him as Shorty. They just always call him Shorty, right? So is there a John Shorty problem? Do we have to explain how it is that John interacts with Shorty? Well, no, they're just two ways of describing exactly the same thing. And that's the attitude that Ryle has towards the brain versus the mind. Is they're not in any sort of competition with each other. They're not opposites of anything. They are just two ways of describing exactly the same thing. And this view becomes very, very popular with the people that Moreland in our previous lecture called the physicalists or the materialists. Materialists write books with titles like The Self as Brain, right? You, according to the physicalists, the materialists, you are just your brain. And when you talk about being hungry, and wanting a hamburger for dinner, or wanting to go see a movie sometime, you are just describing one way that your physical brain is, right? If we could hook you up to an fMRI machine or some other device that's popular with neuroscientists, we might be able to describe in a more scientifically objective and accurate way your desire to see a movie or your desire for a hamburger. But the way that you describe your physical brain state is, I'm hungry, I want a burger, right? So the bottom line is we don't have to describe how the mind and the brain interact or how they compete with each other. They're just two ways of describing the same thing. There's no interaction involved. that is Ryle's position on the mind-body problem, and why the mind-body problem is not a problem at all. Is just a very old mistake that Descartes made, and we are still fighting about it. So, okay, give me just a second, and we will talk about B.F. Skinner. Okay, so Ryle's article and his writings have a big impact on philosophy, and they, as I said before, they really dualism's already kind of on its way out, but it really puts a nail in the coffin. And Ryle's idea of a category of mistake sort of becomes the sort of go-to argument for people who would like to dispense with the mind-body problem and with dualism, right? Now, Ryle himself, it should be noted, he didn't mind talking about mental states. He didn't mind talking about like beliefs and belief desire states. He just thought that we needed to make absolutely sure that we know what we're talking about whenever we use that terminology. It's really just loose talk, right? When you say you want something, or you fear something, or you believe something, you're really just sort of describing a way your physical brain is, that we don't yet have the sort of technology or neurological understanding to be more accurate about, right? So Ryle wasn't really terribly fanatical about eliminating mental talk from our conversations. Now we're going to talk about people who, in his tradition, kind of take it to the next step, right? Now what we're going to talk about is what a concept of mind or a concept of psychology would look like from a purely physicalist point of view. If you want to give up 100% on the idea that there is a non-physical mind, or that there are non-physical mental states, what would that theory of psychology look like? And it would look like what's called behaviorism, right? So, and if you've taken a psychology class, you've probably talked about behaviorism and B.F. Skinner. And what we're going to talk about is sort of his more philosophical writings. So, okay, so let's find our terminology. Behaviorism is a psychological theory that emphasizes behavior rather than internal states. So, now, what does that mean? Well, there is a very familiar story that we tell ourselves about the relationship between our internal mental states and our actions, right? So, my wife is sitting here, Beth. She let's say that as a psychological experiment, I say, "Hey Beth, I have a present for you," and I open a box and I throw a snake at her, right? And she's terrified of snakes, and she's looking at me like she'd like to kill me right now. We may get divorced as a result of this conversation. I'm not going to throw a snake at you. Normally I do this in class, I pick on a student and throw a snake or a spider at them, right? But anyway, what happens? She screams, she runs out of the room, she probably calls the police later on whenever the police come to question me about our domestic dispute, right? The familiar story that we tell ourselves is this: I threw the snake at her, she became terrified, she screamed, and she ran out of the room, right? Now, the question that the behaviorists are going to pose here is, well, now, is that really what happened? I mean, how much work is her fear really doing there? Because in a lot of cases, when we encounter something that really startles or terrifies us, we act and run away. And it's only as we're running away that we begin to feel afraid, that we begin to, the stress hormones kick in, and we're really like, oh God, I'm terrified, right? The behaviorists point out that the very familiar story that we tell ourselves has some parts that are extraneous. They don't really need to be there. Give me a second for some notes. So, if we want to predict what Beth will do under these certain circumstances, we typically tell ourselves a three-part story. There is something that happens. There is the emotional response to that factor, that environmental factor, and then there's the behavior. Right? So it goes like this. This is the typical story. What will Beth do? Well, we begin with the environmental factor, that is the snake that I threw at her. That leads, we say, to an internal state of fear and panic. And then that in turn leads to some sort of behavior. That word's behavior, I kind of ran out of room, right? This behavior includes screaming, fleeing, and getting a divorce. Right. Now, the behaviorist point is this, that we have spent so much time, personally, intellectually, scientifically, concerned about these internal states, and how these internal states lead to behavior. And where has that gotten us? Well, B.F. Skinner and the behaviorists say, it's gotten us nowhere. The truth is you can't see those internal states, and they figure not at all in our ability to guess what Beth will do, right? If what we want in the theory of psychology is to understand and predict human behavior, we can see the environmental factors, and we can see the behavior. And given the environmental factors, we can explain and predict the behavior. So what work are these internal mental states, these belief and desire states doing? And the behaviorist says, nothing. Just tell me what happened and tell me what the reaction was. And that's the whole story. At least that's the only story that matters. So the behaviorists are very, very suspicious, more than suspicious. They're very, very skeptical that these internal belief desire states influence our behavior at all, or for that matter, even really exist. They're really just, they think, window dressing. The truth is, we move around our environment, we react to our environment, and we react to our environment in understandable ways. And very often, these explanations that we give about how we felt or what we were thinking as we were running away or fleeing the snake or doing whatever, they're just maybe stories we tell ourselves later, right? So the behaviorists as psychologists, as therapists, if you go to a behaviorist therapist, instead of sitting on a couch and talking about your mother and trying to explore your sort of deeper inner feelings, they're much more about just trying to change your behavior, right? If you're doing something that you don't like, that you want to stop doing, then we need to work on ways to get you to stop doing what you're doing, right? Skinner thinks that these inner causes that we're constantly citing, they're nothing short of superstitious. They're doing no work at all, and they really have the same status as I said before, as in previous generations. People couldn't understand why some people got sick, or why some women had miscarriages. And you couldn't understand this without attributing it to people giving you the evil eye, or there being evil spirits that are conspiring against you, right? Those explanations, as spurious and false as they were, they help people understand the world, right? Not well, but they help people at least believe that they could make sense of the world. And the behaviorists think that these inner causes, like belief and desire states, are just ways that we sort of try to make sense of our own behavior. When if you really want to know why we behave the way that we do, look at factors in our heredity and in our environment. Look at factors in our sort of genetic makeup, but most of all, look at factors in our history of how we have been how we've been taught to behave. What behaviors in the past have been rewarded? What behaviors in the past have been punished? Right? If you have a bad habit, you've developed that bad habit because at some point that habit was rewarded. And if you want to break that bad habit, then it takes a conscious effort to try to stop engaging in that bad habit, right? So, okay, give me one more minute. So what we face with behaviorism is a kind of revolution in understanding human behavior, one that totally rejects any sort of internal mental states. And Skinner, in fact, is skeptical that mental states, not only that they're causally effective, but but even that they exist at all, right? Instead of explaining why, that Beth ran away from the snake because she was scared, we should just say she saw the snake and she ran, right? Instead of saying that the horse drank the water because he was thirsty, we should say that the horse drank the water because he was water deprived, right? What we have then is we have a description of the behavior of things that's entirely observable and entirely scientific, according to Skinner, right? So, to explain behavior, according to Skinner, we should consider only the environment, the world around us, the history of the organism, the things the organism has gone through, and particularly the history of reinforcement. This is going to be a very important concept in behaviorism. We are all hardwired to experience certain kinds of pleasure and certain kinds of pain. And if we experience pleasure when we do something, we are more likely to repeat that behavior. If we experience pain, we are less likely to repeat that behavior. Actually, the way to get behavior, the most efficient way to get a behavior never repeated is to totally ignore it. If I do something and it has no reaction at all, my attention isn't called to it at all, and and I tend not to repeat it, right? So behaviorism is the source of the sort of old idea of the sometimes you see in movies psychologists using shock therapy, some kinds of shock therapy that, whenever somebody does something bad, they shock them, you do some sort of bad behavior and you zap them, right? Well, that's sort of a funny way of presenting some of the behaviorist ideas, right? But B.F. Skinner is totally serious about the idea that if we could perfectly control the environment and the history and the reinforcement schedule of a person or an organism, we could get that organism or person to do anything. There's some sort of famous stories about how far B.F. Skinner wanted to take this. He proposed and was turned down by the Air Force. He said that he could teach pigeons to fly an F-15, right? Using his techniques, right? Skinner was crazy about pigeons and rats. He thought that there was basically nothing that he couldn't teach a pigeon and a rat to do, right? Yeah. He also, you might have heard the story. There's another sort of infamous story about him. He developed a special kind of baby crib called a Skinner box that was meant to control the everything the baby saw, like how much light and how much exposure to the outside world it had. And this didn't go over well or sell very well. His daughter, however, said that she never considered the Skinner box to be particularly abusive. So there's a ringing endorsement. But yes, Skinner was quite a character. Skinner rejects inner causes, that is, mental states, belief and desire states, because they're not observable. I can't see your thoughts about things. I can't see your beliefs and desires. And also, beliefs and desires and mental states, they can just sort of be invented as needed, right? We can just sort of make them up as we go along. I mean, we can say, well, yeah, I did that because I was feeling bad that day, right? Or I did that because, I did that bad thing because I have a bad habit of doing that, and that's just part of my nature, right? And Skinner wants to stop talking about those sort of inner causes and those inner states and start talking about specifically what factors in the environment lead to certain kinds of behavior. And if we can control that, well, we can control you. Which is at the end of the day what psychologists want to do, right? Okay. So some final thoughts on Skinner. Back in the 1950s and the 1960s, he was going big guns. He made a lot of progress showing how it is that by controlling the environment of organisms, we can get them to engage in all sorts of very complex behavior, right? Whether or not it remained an open question whether or not his variety of behaviorism could explain all behavior, and whether or not we can eventually do entirely away with internal mental states, and whether or not they play a role in a necessary role in explaining human life and human behavior. And a lot of people have pointed out that attributing mental states to people actually does help us predict, from a moment to moment, does help us predict their behavior better than just looking at their history and their environment and trying to figure out their history of their history of conditioning, right? If somebody pulls out a gun and says your money or your life, who's better at predicting what happens next? B.F. Skinner and knowing about your history of conditioning, or somebody who attributes fear to you, right? Well, I think the person who attributes fear to you is going to correctly predict you're probably going to give up your wallet, right? So, just as a minor footnote in all of this, Skinner's philosophy of behaviorism really encounters the real crisis comes in the 1960s and 1970s when it becomes clear that behaviorism has no way of explaining the evolution of language. We learn a lot of things through trial and error in life, right? We don't learn language through trial and error. The work of some philosophers like Noam Chomsky come to establish that as a fact. I don't have to go through every sentence in the English language kind of one by one and try them all out to see which one works in communicating. we just seem to have some sort of innate ability to operate language in certain ways, and behaviorism has nothing to say about that. So behaviorism kind of as a philosophical movement kind of falls out of favor. So anyway, if you care about that kind of thing. So okay, so that is sort of a crash course in major physicalists, major non-dualists. We talked about Ryle. We talked about his trenchant takedown of substance dualism, and then we talked about B.F. Skinner and his attempts to build a psychological theory that dispenses with psychology. So, okay, so that's all I have to say for now. So I will catch you guys later on. Bye-bye. The attendance password is snake. That's right. My wife's favorite animal, the snake. Okay, see you guys later.